So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Emma Lindley. I'm one of the co-founders of Women in Identity. And I'm here with Vyjayanti Desai, who is from the World Bank. I'm going to let Vyjayanti introduce herself very shortly. But before that, we've just got a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to talk you through how today's webinar is going to go ahead and how you can ask some questions. So right now, everybody is on mute. If you would like to ask a question, you can either raise your hand to ask a question, because we have the fantastic Caitlin who's in the background, and she is going to make sure that you can ask your question live, or you can pop your question in the chat box at any point in time as well. If you want to ask a question, please identify yourself so we can introduce you to others. And all our webinars are recorded for our members who can't attend, and they'll be available on our YouTube channel. So just a little bit about a Women in Identity before we start the interview with Vyjayanti. So we've been registered formally for about 2 years. We're a non-profit led and we're organised entirely by volunteers all over the globe. We actually have now a US entity as well as the entity in the UK. And we've got 1,200 members across the world in 32 countries. We've got 15 ambassadors in the countries here, and you can see our ambassadors on the screen. And we've got nearly 6,000 followers, and that is growing all of the time. So why Women in Identity, and what are we all about? So we set Women in Identity up really to aim to get more diversity into the workforce of digital identity, it being a technical field. And our aim is to inspire, elevate and support a more diverse workforce in the identity industry. And our aim is really to have identity solutions intended for everyone need to be built by and designed by everybody. If you want to follow us, these are our hashtags. We're on Twitter and on LinkedIn and also on Instagram. But these are the hashtags if you want to follow us, or if you want to tweet about any of the content today. So before we carry on, I would like to say welcome to Vyjayanti Desai, who is from the World Bank. And what better day for us to be chatting, Vyjayanti, other than International Women's Day 2021. And we know that the hashtag for today is Choose for Challenge. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen now as we go into our interview. Okay, perfect. So Vyjayanti, I mean, I am aware of a lot of the work that you have done over the years, and I'm sure there'll be some people that have tuned in today, because I know when I put this on the LinkedIn post and also tweeted it out, I've had kind of quite a few people saying, oh, you know, I'm going to tune in. So I think that, you know, we had people from the Canadian government and things saying they were going to tune in today. So I'm sure there's people that know about your work. But there'll be people that don't know about the work that you do. So I'd love to know just a little bit about yourself. And I'm sure the audience would really like to know a little bit about you and a little bit more about the work that you do at World Bank.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Emma, for having me on International Women's Day. I'm honored deeply to be asked, particularly on this day. You know, I've been managing the Identification for Development initiative at the bank for the last 5 years, and the goal of the program is to really help countries realize the transformational potential of digital identification and identification, moreover, in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And you know, it touches upon, there's one Sustainable Development Goal in particular, but it really touches upon countless numbers of Sustainable Development Goals. And I've been also more recently managing the G2Px initiative, which is really about digitizing payments to individuals with a particular goal around empowering women, financial inclusion. And these two initiatives together really are, in a way, reimagining the way that we think about the digital rails in countries, ID, payments, trusted data exchange, how this sort of digital stack can really help the way that governments transact with individuals, the way that individuals transact with governments, the way that individuals transact with one another, and really a sense of empowerment and inclusion. So, from a women's economic empowerment angle, both ID and payments, especially government-to-person payments, are so critical. We know, for example, of the 1 billion people globally who are unable to prove who they are. This is an estimate that we have been collecting for the last several years, that 1 in 2 women in low-income countries are disproportionately affected compared to 1 in 3 men. So there is a significant gap, particularly in a handful of low-income countries. And so we really are trying to not only elevate this agenda moreover and help countries fill that gap, but also particularly focused on women's economic empowerment.
Okay, cool. That's great. And tell us a little bit about your journey. How did you get to where you are today and the work that you're doing in the World Bank?
So I actually, believe it or not, joined the World Bank 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago. It was my 20th anniversary. And when I joined, I never thought that I would actually stay this long. The topic of identity is not something that I started working on 20 years ago. I worked on a number of different development issues. And actually before the World Bank, my passion for international development started actually when I was quite young, when I was in my late teens. And all through college and graduate school, I did a number of different internships, a number of different jobs, even post graduate school, and just kept reaffirming my passion and real keen interest in international development. I worked a lot on issues of financial inclusion, on broader private sector development, a whole range of other, and I realized several years ago how critical identification is to, as I mentioned, a number of these different goals. And I think I get most excited, although sometimes people don't quite understand why, but these really sticky development issues that require a multi-sectoral approach. So it's not a single sector lens that will really solve this issue. And I thrive, I really enjoy trying to work on some of those multi-sectoral agendas, and which is why I came into this topic and this agenda 5-6 years ago, and it's wonderful to see how much this, I think, in the overall agenda has been raised and elevated to importance more broadly in the development spectrum. So that's a little bit about how I got into this agenda. And it wasn't as though I know that some people may assume that my journey started with ID3D. I actually worked on a number of different sector agendas, but all from a development lens.
I mean, it's interesting, when I chat to people about their journey into the identity sphere. And I don't think I've come across anybody yet that's gone, this is what I set out to do, I mean, I always kind of recount my, the holiday season when I go home to my family, and I've worked in this space for 20 years. And I still don't think they know what I do or care what I do, to be honest. So I think it's interesting,
and people take it so for granted too, right? So
yes,
I think you and I and those of us that we interact with, particularly in the developed world, I think take the topic so for granted, and it's one of these underlying foundational development agendas that don't necessarily surface front and center, but I agree completely.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about it in this sector, we talk about it like it's a thing, and we have this expectation that everybody knows what this thing is. But when you're talking to people that like my family, for example, I have to break it down into those. Well, it's like when you go and open a bank account and you need to produce your documentation. Oh, right, yeah, well, that's that's annoying. And I'm like, yeah, it is. You know, and then it's like, and then all my usernames and passwords, and, you know, my dad will go, yeah, we that's really complicated. So I think it's, you know, I think if he could wave his magic wand, he would try and fix a lot of those things.
Yeah, but it's one thing though, just on that, is I think the COVID-19 pandemic has really shined the light on this agenda, and also just the broader digital infrastructure agenda overall. So, you know, around 200 countries globally, when COVID hit, immediately tried to respond to providing social assistance to those who needed it the most. And it was indeed the countries that had some of this digital infrastructure in place that was able to respond faster, more effectively, and ensure that the funding got to the right beneficiaries. So I do think people realize it much more now so than before.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I'm based in the UK, as you know, and I mean, we don't have a digital identity infrastructure here, and I think it has been one of the, it's going to be a big acceleration moment for the UK. But I can remember somebody asking my husband and saying, what is it that she does? I don't really understand what it is that she does, you know, and I think people are, and he works in financial services, you know, but I think people are now starting to go, actually, yeah, you know, the penny's dropping. If we had that baseline of infrastructure in place, and it's like plumbing, isn't it? You know, it isn't until you know, the water's kind of spurting out of the floor in your house that you kind of go, oh, actually, yeah, you know, I need a plumber, or actually the pipes are broken. You know, it's not the most exciting topic in the world necessarily, but it is a foundational thing that if we don't have it, it's one of the building blocks that we can't build upon. So just in terms of your journey, what would you say the most important lesson that you've learned along the way?
So, I mean, there's a lot of important lessons I think that we all can, and I continue to learn. I don't think anyone ever stops learning. So I'm sure if you ask me 5 years from now, it may adjust. But I think there are two things in particular that I continue to really emphasize, and I also just, you know, I think I continue even to tell my teenage kids, and, you know, all the time, is one is just the importance of a sense of agency and individual empowerment and collective empowerment. So, you know, I think people often forget that they have the ability to really change, whether it's even in a small scale, whether it's at a community level or a large scale at a global level, just the unbelievable opportunity to be a change maker, to do things and really shape an agenda, and not necessarily wait for a system or a policy or something to be miraculously created that, you know, you individually can really help shape an agenda. And I often tell this to young professionals who join the bank group, that, you know, it may seem like we're a large organization, a large bureaucracy, but actually you can be quite entrepreneurial as long as you don't surprise people and you bring people along. And it's one of those things that I think that collective action, and I think it doesn't have to be in big ways, it can be in small ways, and just feeling that sense of agency. And I think it's really important, particularly for the younger generation, to really appreciate that lesson. It's a lesson that I learned tremendously over the years, and I really do think I strongly believe that that's one lesson. I think the other is around collaboration, and it's very linked. That, you know, yes, you have individual agency, but I think that collective sense of being able to do things. And I love my favorite quote that I keep repeating to my kids, to their annoyance, actually, is Margaret Mead's quote that never doubt a group of thoughtful, committed citizens. I might not be getting it right, but never doubt a group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And I think that collective action and collaboration, and, you know, this agenda on ID3D, for example, and G2Px, is a multi-sectoral. So it's a whole of institution initiative that we really see how different teams with different sector lenses coming together has made such a difference in the potential impact of this agenda. And so both within the World Bank group, it's across what we call cross-global practice initiative, where teams across so many different parts, 10 different parts, in fact, and directors, have really shaped this from the very beginning, and has been quite critical to the impact that we've had. But also, Jen, the collaboration with external partners and other organizations. And for example, the principles that we just relaunched collectively, which a few years ago was with 25 organizations. Now the same 25 organizations have come back, and I think that having that shared vision and that collective vision has been so critical. And so I think collaboration is a second important lesson that I've carried for the last several years.
So I love to hear you talk about collaboration, because it is one of the things that certainly I talk about in the context of identity, because it's certainly it's not one of those things that one organization or one sector is going to solve. And just touching on the principles, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because I know that there was an updated set of principles released last week, and with that collaboration in mind, the World Bank and also Women in Identity were one of the endorsing organisations for those principles. And so I'd like to just talk a little bit about the principles now for a moment, because I'm sure some people in the audience will be interested, and I'm just going to remind the audience, if they have got a question or if they want to drop any questions into the chat box, do that, because we'll be pausing shortly after this section to pause for questions. So just in terms of I'd love to get your perspective on the principles, and share what do you, from your perspective, what do you think the importance of having these principles is?
So, it really started quite organically a few years ago, where I think the sense was that there would be this, having a shared vision of what good looked like in this agenda would be really important. And wouldn't it be even more powerful if it was a shared vision across a number of organizations? And so it was, as I said, an organic process where we brought different organizations that we knew were working on this agenda together, and we just kept adding more and more organizations. And the World Bank helped in shepherding the process. It by no means is a World Bank principles. I know sometimes people refer to that, but it's actually a shared set of principles. We played the role of shepherding it. And the North Star has been so impactful for a lot of the work we do with countries, and it's really built around some main themes of inclusion and trust. And so how do we ensure that ID systems are accessible to all? How do we ensure that some of the impediments and barriers to accessing ID are eliminated? The trust agenda of data protection, privacy. I mean, if individuals don't trust the ID systems, and I don't think it's going to be effective, and it's not going to the transformational potential that we talk about isn't going to be realized. So it has been a guiding North Star. Both, I mean, it's been infused into global documents. For example, the UN high-level cooperation, digital cooperation report, or the Financial Action Task Force, or UNHCR's I Belong. I mean, there's been a number of different global reports, but really at the most important, I think, is at the country level, where a number of different countries have really embraced these principles and infused it within their own policy documents. So whether it's, I mean, a handful of countries, and I'm not going to name all of them, but in their own government policy documents has infused the principles throughout, and also just made sure it doesn't stay in documents, but it actually is implemented in practice. So whether it's things like removing some of the discriminatory barriers to obtaining an ID. So we know, for example, there can be a number of different documents required to even get a basic form of ID. And if you don't have those documents, you're going to leave a good proportion of the population out, or things like not needing to collect lots of information and lots of data on individuals, just the basic minimum data, or how do you ensure the ID systems are proportional to their use. So, these are all these elements in these 10 principles. And so that was what we had all as a collective set of organizations put out a few years ago. And we had at that time committed to revisiting the principles. We knew this agenda was a pretty fast moving agenda, and there were a lot of important lessons, particularly from a development lens, a lot of lessons that we might want to reflect. And so we kept to that commitment that we had a few years ago, and brought the different organizations back together again. I mean, what was great is that actually it reaffirmed, the process of bringing everyone back together and reflecting on it. And we also went through public consultations and some CSO consultations, and it reaffirmed that the principles were essentially still very sound. So there wasn't massive changes required, but that we did end up focusing a bit more and bringing some greater clarity and focus around the areas of inclusion and trust. And so so that process, I think, was wonderful. And in the process, when the launches happened, not only did all the original 25 organizations come back and re-endorse, but also yourselves and Digital Nations and NORAD also joined the other 25 organizations. And these 25 organizations span several UN agencies, a number of the foundations like Gates Foundation and others, as well as some other private sector associations.
That's so interesting. I mean, as I said, being based in the UK, I think, and I've worked on a number of projects in the UK looking at inclusion. And I think people can look at countries like the UK and go, well, everybody in the UK must have, an identity document. And that in itself is not true. We have about 50% of people in the UK that don't have a passport and driving license. We don't have an ID card. And, we have 11% of, people in the UK that can't even turn on a device. And so I think, that aspect of making sure that we aren't leaving people behind, particularly when we think about these identity systems as being, I talk about them as being the gateway to all of these other accessibility and all these other services. And if if you're stopped at the first pass and you actually can't get through the identity system because of some baseline information or documentation or process you haven't been through, you then can't go and do anything else. And I know that in the UK Trust Framework, they have brought in this concept, and it's all still in consultation discussion now, but they've brought in this concept of vouching, which is interesting because that's something that we've seen in other countries. And I think in the UK people went, well, we don't need vouching. Why would we need vouching? And I think people have kind of gone, oh, actually we might need that. We might need. So
this is individuals vouching for one another if they don't have. Interesting. I did not realize that was.
Yeah. So because people don't have passports and driving licenses, and there's this whole intersection with those people and poverty, because they say, well, I'm not going to buy a passport because it's about £80 to buy a passport and I can't afford to go abroad. Why would I have a driving license? Because I can't afford driving lessons and I can't afford a car. So you've got all of this kind of intersectionality between those and other areas, and then we take those already marginalized groups and make their lives more difficult. And so I think it's interesting the approach that the UK government is taking now. And so I want to touch back on something that you mentioned earlier on, and it being International Women's Day. I wanted to talk a little bit about in the principles it talks about marginalized groups, and it talks specifically calling out women and girls. I know you mentioned it early on, but I'd be interested just to hear your thoughts again, just about how you think identity or lack of identity specifically affects groups, including particularly women and girls.
Yeah, no, so we know from our from the data we collect, and this is well, we added questions into the Findex data that's done every 3 years. And so from the last round, and we'll be updating it in this coming year, that we know 1 in 2 women in low-income countries have this gender gap. So which is different than men. So 1 in 3 men in low-income countries. So it does disproportionately affect women. And it is really concentrated, I would say, in about, at least according to those countries collected, about 24 or so countries. And what we've found in those countries where there is the gender gap, it's around a few things. So, for example, some have discriminatory laws that require women to either get the permission of her husband or to be accompanied by a male guardian. And I think that just continues to exacerbate the issue. I think women also face additional, what they say, and this is also comes from qualitative end user research that we've been increasingly doing in a number of countries, is harassment when they're trying to get their IDs, or even lower motivation, not knowing how they would be using the IDs, or lower mobility issues. And so all of these things, it's important to basically identify the barriers and discriminatory laws, so that both reviewing the laws, removing some of those barriers, but then also making it more accessible for women, whether it's, mobility, increasing mobile registration and making it safer for women to access, having, we know in some countries, having an all-female enrollment center made people feel much more comfortable. I think also measuring the gap. So what we've been doing, and I think more and more people measuring the gap will be helpful. So these are all things that can help in reducing that gender gap. But in terms of why it's so important, more broadly, why ID and why the World Bank and other development actors are engaged in this topic is the link, as you said, ID to financial inclusion. All the know your customer regulations of needing documentation, and we know 1 in 5 people who haven't opened a bank account or unable to open a bank account is because of lack of documentation. And so for women's financial inclusion, that's definitely going to be a barrier. Or for ID with the delivery of social assistance. So when women are able to receive the social assistance, the cash transfers in their own hands, in their own bank accounts, we know the important role that plays in their own agency, in increased decision making and control over how the money is spent, and oftentimes actually helps in their own children's nutrition and education as well. So when women are able to ensure that they receive the payments in their own hands, they can make more informed decisions, both not only for themselves, but also for the family members. And it goes on, ID for health insurance. So the impact that ID has more broadly on development is important, but I think with the emphasis on women's empowerment is even more so. So that's precisely why I think it's important to make sure we ensure that the laws are addressed, the practices are improved, as well as then that any other remaining barriers, even in the link between ID and the service delivery, is also strengthened.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to hear you talk then, because not a lot of what you talked about was technology. And I think when we think about the field that we work in, this digital identity field, it's seen as being just a technical field, and I think it's often seen as being a technical field, and I think for that reason it attracts perhaps people that want to work in just in perhaps a technical field. And hearing you talk, then you didn't touch that much on in terms of the barriers on technology too much, and when we look at the actual principles themselves, there's things like, as you said, inclusion, governance, transparency, accountability, legal trust, and and they're given just as much weighting as some of the elements like open standards, and some of the technical aspects. So how important do you think it is to have, non-technical as well as technical people working in the field of digital identity, and why?
So I think it's absolutely critical, and this is why even in the principles we call out for the different stakeholders. So I think there's certainly government, private sector, civil society organizations, many of these stakeholders that are important for this agenda. And I think the technology is important. And I think open standards is certainly important, because otherwise that interoperability. So when we talk about even within a country, interoperability with various other sort of, whether it's social protection programs or the financial institutions, whatever it may be, that interoperability is critical. But when we think even at the global level, if we're talking about digital economy and trade, e-commerce, whatever it may be, the interoperability between countries. So we often say that each country is probably not going to have the same cookie cutter kind of ID system, but that mutual recognition across borders is certainly important. And I think in Europe, that the EIDAS is already underway. And I know that other regions like Africa are in the midst of thinking through the design of those. So technology is important, but it's one part of the puzzle. The laws and regulations, and so when we support countries in this, it's all elements of it. So starting from even the vision, right? So the vision of an ID system and how it's going to be leveraged is critical, whether it's part of this really considered a digital platform for broader service delivery is one of the key parts of a vision, and thinking about it as a whole of country approach as opposed to some sector silo kind of a system. So, starting from the vision, the laws and regulations, the engagement and public consultations, not only with civil society, but with individuals, so that it really puts the individual at the center. I think oftentimes we think about these as an ID system, but it's really, in the end, it's meant to be there to support individuals. And so, having that at the center of this is quite important. So yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of elements that are required to make the system overall strong.
Yeah, I sometimes, probably controversially, say, we've got all the technology that we need. We perhaps don't even, and it's 10% of the problem that we're trying to fix, and the other 90% is actually the really complicated stuff, the legal stuff, the governance stuff, the interoperability, and often that's a set of agreements versus actual technology. So yes, probably controversial.
The one thing though with technology though that is an area that we're working on is to avoid systems that are going to lock in countries in for a decade or more. And so that's where open standards, open source comes into play. And things like having to re-enroll individuals because they're being locked into one system, or ensuring that when you want some change in the system that you don't have these ridiculous change fees and things of that nature, and the interoperability in and of itself. So
yeah, and I know that that's work that organisations like MOSIP are trying to work to make sure that we've got these open platforms to because that's better for everybody, right? So so just in terms of the thinking again about the and I'm going to ask anybody if they've got any questions, because I am going to pause after this next question for audience questions. So if anyone has got any questions, please just either raise your hand or pop them in the chat box. Someone has just actually made a question, so I'll wait till this next section. So just thinking about the principles and this next set of the principles and the updated version, we've obviously seen a huge amount of impact that the principles have had, and you said that they've kind of infused into a variety of different guises and organizations. And it's interesting because when I see private sector organizations and they've set out their principles for identity, I see real strong elements of those original kind of principles for sustainable development in there. What's the impact in the industry you would like to see with the updates to these principles?
So I think, I mean, just reaffirming the importance of these principles. And so the update in a way reminds everyone that these principles exist, that countries are really adopting them, but that it's, really can be adopted by a whole range of different organizations. It doesn't have to be only a set of countries. And I think just reaffirming again the focus on inclusion and trust and good design, that we don't have to start from scratch. So there's no need to think about what a good ID system, that I think, there's been wonderful input from across the globe on these principles. And I think from an industry perspective, that many countries are really visioning ID systems as this sort of part of a digital rail. So a digital rail for the overall digital economy and transformation of service delivery, and that there's so much innovation that can be built on top of this foundational layer. I think, a good sort of basic ID system wouldn't try to do everything, because that's where I think private sector can come in and innovate on top of it. But it really is those rails in a way that allow innovative applications, like the ability for individuals to be able to transact more effectively, more efficiently, faster. Those will all come with innovation that I think the industry can play a significant role.
Okay, cool. Right, so I'm going to see if we've got any questions. So we have got one question that's been posed to us from the audience. And if anyone else has got any more questions, you can either raise your hand, or you can pop a question into the chat box. So this is from Dina Qureshi, and she's saying, Vyjayanti, you make a really important point bringing up the issue of interoperability. The question is, what do you see as some of the critical success factors that will help bring down the barriers in terms of interoperability?
So on the, I think standards, and agreed set of standards is obviously one big part of this. We had, actually in more of the convening role we play, because we're not a standard setting body as a World Bank, but we had brought together a number of different organizations about 2-3 years ago and pulled together, and it's on our website, a guide on existing standards, because we actually saw there were a number of ISO and other standards that did exist, but it had never really been pulled together as part of the broader ID lifecycle. And so, so that was just really doing the homework and saying, well, these standards exist. So when thinking about a system, consider using these open standards. I mean, what we, I think, have realized is that, with the whole discussion about open source and more open standards, is there might be areas that still are sticky, that haven't been fully yet solved from some of these existing open standards. And so we're just about to launch another series of consultations with organization standards bodies, but others, and hearing from both people who have been implementing some of these systems, people who have been part of designing some of these standards, and just others interested, individuals and organizations, about is there more that can be done around this agenda. And so we're just beginning that exercise. And so if anyone on this webinar is interested, please do let us know, and we'll make sure to involve you and your organization. And I think beyond standards is also just some of the things like procurement rules. So, standards by itself is not going to solve all the problems. And, even in things like in contracts and others, that you could still have challenges with interoperability if not carefully considered. And so that's another area where, and again, we had done a guide, a procurement checklist guide, which is just a start of what people can think about when to avoid some of these potential areas that could become problematic. But I think these are two in particular.
Okay, cool. We haven't got any more questions, and I think I was just hearing you talk about, just pulling together all of the work that's kind of happening, and sometimes that's all that needs doing. Because there's a huge amount of work that's happening across the globe in the identity space on things like standards, and I often think people are kind of working in their own little bubble and their own little silo, and just having those places to pull all of that together. I know that the Open Identity Exchange in the UK is trying to do a lot of that work as we go through this kind of next phase of the government trust framework. And we've got 6 or 7 different types of identity schemes, and they're trying to just convene that group and saying, okay, well, let's get some documentation together from everybody, so that there's just a place that people can go to read up about these things. And sometimes that in itself is just is what's needed. So we've actually got another question here. This is from Tim Bulmer. So I don't know if you know Tim. Yes, it's from the Canadian government. So in Canada, combined with our digital charter, our pan-Canadian trust framework, we see the principles as key for the next step for mutual recognition between countries. Is the World Bank seeing a similar step towards better international collaboration and interoperability?
Well, great. And thanks, Tim, for joining. We actually are huge fans of the work that Tim is doing. And yes, I think certainly, we are seeing, for example, even in the Africa region. So, and we're going to be engaging much more with the African Union, but there's other organizations like Smart Africa and UNECA have been working on interoperability amongst countries within the Africa region. And I think there's both standards, but also just the layer above that, the mutual recognition that, we've learned a lot from what has been put in place in EIDAS. And I know that EIDAS is also going through some sort of reflection and lessons on the last many years of implementation of EIDAS. So we want to ensure that we're incorporating those lessons in as well, so that we're not just stuck on what it was, at the beginning. And so yes, and the reality is also, I think, not only within a region, but across regions, this has to, we have to ensure the complementarity, because the last thing I think any region wants to do is just to have the ability to interoperate amongst the region, but not with the rest of the globe. And so, I mean, if Tim has some suggestions there, I think it would be great. I know that also with, this dialogue is also brought into the G20 on the cross-border payments. And so ID is one angle of that, which we're engaging. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to do more in this space.
Okay, cool, thank you. So we haven't got any more questions. So I've actually got another, so I wanted to just talk more about, diversity and inclusion in terms of, the diversity and inclusion and at an organisation level. So we often at Women in Identity talk about the importance of having diverse teams in terms of building identity systems, and that's not just gender diversity, and it's there really to mitigate the bias that could be encoded into these systems. And we talked about some of the issues that can happen when people can't get access to financial services, for example, and ultimately what we could be doing by having homogenous teams, there's going to be more likely to kind of have bias, and that being coded in the systems, and then people potentially not be able to access things like financial services because they can't get through the identity system. In terms of, diversity is such a massive topic, and we've got 15 minutes left, so we're not going to be able to answer it all today, but I'd really love to know from your perspective why diversity matters in your work and what it means to you.
So, just as you said, diversity, I think, is critical, and it's not just gender diversity, it's not ethnic diversity or racial diversity, it's a whole range of different issues, and even just diversity of thoughts, right? So you could even have within a homogenous group of people, the need to have a diversity of thought, so that you avoid this sort of groupthink kind of a problem. But, and this is why also, even for going back to the identity agenda at a country level, having public consultations, having civil society consultations, having more of this end user, sort of the qualitative research, so hearing from individuals, is so critical. So that again, that these are developed and designed with a range of different individuals in mind. One of the things I'm quite proud of is actually that our I feel as though both in the technology space and in the identity space, there's still a huge gap in women who are engaged. And so, we have about actually 80% of our team are women. And I know that's not good to always be too skewed towards that angle, but I feel like we're bridging that gap a bit with, and maybe in the next generation of people in the technology field as well as identity field, we're helping nudge more women in that direction. And actually, like one of the male members of our team yesterday, because he's 12 hours ahead of us, so it was International Women's Day. He did a WhatsApp and said how proud he was to be in a female dominated team. So, but no, I think it is quite important. It's important for, I think, the way we work and operate as a team on a day-to-day basis, on a week-to-week basis, but also I think at a country level, ensuring that all the voices are heard and that it is, as you said very, very well, that you don't infuse biases into systems.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well done on your team with your 80%. I think there's probably no denying that probably the rest of the industry has got a bit catching. That's the benchmark.
Yes,
That's a bit of catching up to do. And I think the digital identity industry, like the rest of the technology industry, is not particularly diverse. So I've got kind of one last question around that, and before we go into asking the audience for any more questions. But how do you think that we bridge the gap between kind of highlighting the problems? Because there's a piece around kind of going, we've got this big problem with diversity and inclusion in this industry, and then how do you think we kind of bridge that gap to actually addressing them? Have you got any thoughts around that at all?
So is this more like in terms of the expertise that is available?
Yeah.
And
I think it's just in the digital identity industry, how do we get to 50-50 would be nice, wouldn't it? Right. So how do we actually get to that level of rather than almost, I talk about often admiring the problem, talking about the problem and admiring it, to actually getting some actionable change to where we can, encourage more women to join, keep women in the industry. How do we do that? Have you got any thoughts? How did you do it in the bank?
Yeah, I think on the technology side is where I feel like the gap still remains, and I'm hopeful that will be overcome. And I just think the focus at least in some of the education here in the US as well as around the globe, the focus on STEM, girls in STEM is wonderful to see. I myself just know a lot of the young women in their early 20s who have chosen engineering paths. My niece, for example, has chosen an engineering path and is in technology field now, and you're hearing that more and more. So I do think we will bridge some of the gap that's existed in the past, and so I think just investment in women and girls in STEM, I think will be critical. I don't think we should let up at all just because we're starting to see change. I think having mentors for young women to see, and whether it's in high school or college or graduate school or even in the workplace, having more of the mentorship is going to be critical. And then I think in this identity agenda, just knowing that it's not a technology only, that there's different, I think one of the most exciting parts of this agenda is actually the multi-sectoral nature and how different elements are weaved together to really ensure. And so whether it's for example, on the advocacy angle, advocating for the reduced gap in access to women in a very real way. So for example, and it's not only women, I mean, it's, other minority groups and people with disability and others, being very, very intentional about it and ensuring that these aren't sort of overlooked at the beginning, that it's, as you said, infused in the design. So that's, I mean, we as an institution have become much, much more knowledgeable about some of these gaps in the last 3 years than we did even 5 years ago. So, in almost all the countries we work in, doing some of this qualitative research, hearing from individuals about the day-to-day issues and barriers that people are facing, both in enrollment, but also in use. I think, doing that very, very intentionally is important. I think ensuring that some of these principles are, just not on paper, but are, infused in the dialogue with countries. And it's not going to be overnight. I think that's one of the realities of this agenda. It's not a simple, even like 6-month agenda. It's a multi-year agenda, and just sticking with it and being patient and continuing to reinforce. And I think this is what I find so powerful about having 28, I think 29 will come. Hopefully more organizations will also endorse the principles, just that amplification of this from so many voices globally will only reaffirm, reiterate, and make this agenda even more known, and particularly around the inclusion and trust.
Yeah, I mean, I've been talking a lot about the UK government work because it's something that is happening right now, and they've done a huge amount of work this time round in relation to inclusion. And they've consulted with civil society groups. We've been involved as Women in Identity along the way in lots of consultation, and actually when they did their press release about the trust framework, they talked about inclusion, and they put it front and center, which is so interesting because it's quite different to kind of previous ways in which they perhaps approached it. So I think you're absolutely right. And I think one of the things that I often like to talk about, and I was just listening to you speak then, and I was thinking that's quite similar. I often talk about this industry. You don't need to be a technologist to be in this industry. And we've had a few interns that have come through Women in Identity, and when I've chatted to them, like, they've gone, oh, well, I don't know if I'd want to work in tech because I don't want to be a programmer. And I'm like, well, you don't have to be a programmer. You can work in tech. And I can just remember talking to this young person who was 20 at the time, and just explaining all of these different roles, a product manager and all of these types of things. And she went to me, was that a job? And I was like, well, yeah. product manager's a job, and it's quite a well-paid one, and it's exciting, and and you're not doing programming. And so I think often young people really they might not even know that these roles exist. I mean, I certainly didn't, and I was kind of going through the education system. Right, so I'm going to ask if we've got any more questions. Does anybody else want to ask a question? And then I've got probably one last closing question for you, Vyjayanti, which is any more questions from the audience? Anything else? No? Okay, cool. So my last question for you is, what advice would you give to the younger you?
So, I mean, I think one, I think the whole thing I mentioned before about the change and knowing that, you can make a difference. I think that was, that's something that as I said, I continue to give very unsolicited advice to my teenage boys all the time. So I think that's one. But the other is just, live in the moment and cherish everything and everyone around you. I don't think, I think this COVID pandemic also just showed all of us that no one can predict what will happen, and to really make the best of everything that you have. My mom was quite young when she passed away. She was in her mid-40s from cancer, and I was in high school. And so I think that for me has been one of the most formative things of my life, is that you have to be grounded in just just grounded in things that you have that you can make an impact on, and what's around you, and cherish every moment, and really make the most, because I certainly feel like each individual can make massive difference, and that's why I think we're all here to enjoy the moment, cherish the moments, and also make a difference.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's interesting. I think when we're younger, I think people we tend to give ourselves such a hard time, and as you get older, you kind of go, wow, why was I sweating all of that small stuff, right?
Exactly. And it can be in small ways, it doesn't have to be, in big ways. Just cherish the little things. So I mean, even whether it's a nice walk outside, and I feel like in this COVID pandemic, just the ability, how silent the world was at some points, and you could actually hear all the birds chirping, and finding the simple pleasure sometimes is what you need as well.
I totally agree with that. Right, so we've come to the end of our session. I feel incredibly privileged to have this hour to chat to you. It's been fantastic having you on, and just sharing all of your thoughts there. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. It was an honor
really
to be on this, and particularly on International Women's Day. So I'm really thankful. Thanks for the opportunity.
No worries. Right, so I'm just going to share my screen again, and just if I can get back to my screen. Let me know if you can see my screen now. So just going to go through there. So if you want to join Women in Identity, you can. It is because we set out on a principle of the organisation being completely inclusive to join. It is completely free of charge to join. So you just need to go to www.womeninidentity.org, become a member, and you can join the organisation. You'll obviously get access to knowing about events like this, but you also get our kind of membership community, things like our newsletter, and any kind of communications that we send out. And I want to thank our sponsors. So without our sponsors, we wouldn't be able to keep the wheels turning. Even though we're a volunteer run organisation, we still need some money to kind of run things. So I want to thank all of our sponsors that sponsor us. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Really appreciate your time. And I want to thank Vyjayanti once again for her time. This is going to be uploaded on YouTube. So if you want to see it again, you'll be able to go to our YouTube channel, and it will be sent out in our newsletter as well. Thank you so much for joining, and thanks a lot, Vyjayanti. All right, thanks a lot. Bye-bye.